Hello and welcome to Working Wise, a podcast created and produced by K&L Gates. Each episode is designed to provide labor and employment updates and compliance tips to lawyers and HR professionals. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
Welcome to K&L Gates Working Wise podcast series. My name is Leann Walsh, and I'm a partner in the Raleigh office and a member of the firm's Labor, Employment, and Workplace Safety Practice Group. Joining me today is Ali Greene. She is the founder of Cohana, a business with a mission to educate and inspire teams on how to do their best work regardless of where or what their office looks like. Ali specializes in helping companies and communities optimize their remote work infrastructure to succeed in the changing world of work. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, a number of businesses with historically more traditional physical workspace environments were forced into temporary work-from-home arrangements. As the last several months have gone by, we have found that many businesses and employees have come to enjoy and really appreciate the work-from-home model. Many businesses are now considering moving to a more formal work-from-home model for the long term. In light of that movement, on this podcast today, we will be discussing business and legal tips and considerations when managing a remote workforce. Ali, thanks so much for joining me today. Can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Leann. That was a great introduction, and I'm very excited to be here. As you explained, I'm an advocate of remote work and love thinking about remote work trends. I have 10 years of startup experience, and for the past 4 years, I've been leading remote teams and implementing frameworks for organizations while traveling the world full-time. I'm currently dialing in from Spain, for example.
Thank you. I'm so glad you could join me today. As a professional remote work consultant, do you have any guidance for businesses about developing work expectations for their remote workforce?
Yes. First and foremost, I would urge people, independent contributors, managers, executives, to understand that the past few months are not reflective of sustainable work from home policies. People have been stuck in their homes. They've been dealing with kids out of school. And there's definitely been this learning curve to remote work for many people. Keeping this in mind, I would encourage leaders of organizations to analyze what has been working well and what hasn't been. Where do your employees still need support or processes that will change with the current challenges? For me, remote work needs the following things to be able to succeed. So autonomy, trust, and clear expectations. These three things can be further explored, especially around topics that leaders can have influence on in organizations, such as the type of work from home or work from office balance they're trying to achieve, guidelines that organizations can support around asynchronous or synchronous communication and expectations around communication, things like what recurring meetings and what mandatory meetings exist for employees at all different levels of the organization, what types of project KPIs will be expected of employees and how they will be evaluated, as well as cultural activities. So what types of expectations do you have for employees to participate in virtual and in-person meetups? So thinking about all of these things, companies really need to create a remote friendly as well as legally compliant policies and benefits that will enable their workers to be productive and not fall into these common remote work traps that we've seen, especially over the past few months, such as burnout and isolation.
On the legal front, many state, local, and federal jurisdictions around the world require that employers have certain written policies and procedures for their workforce. The law where the employee is physically working is generally going to be the law that applies at the time. When remote employees relocate frequently, this can pose administrative challenges and is an inevitable consequence of a remote and highly mobile workforce. For example, in the United States, certain laws mandate that employers have specific sick time and leave time policies for employees. The amount of sick and leave time available to the employee will depend on where the employee works and therefore can be subject to change when the employee's remote work location changes. It often takes a sophisticated human resources manager working hand in hand with outside employment law counsel to ensure compliance. Also, because the laws can vary so widely across the world, a one-size-fits-all handbook may not work well for a geographically diverse workforce. Individually linked policies on the company's intranet may be more easily tailored to the particular employees to whom they apply. It is also often easier to update individual policies when laws change rather than reissue entire handbook revisions over and over again. Sick time and leave time laws have been some of the laws changing most rapidly in the last few years. Globally, regions vary quite a bit in terms of required lengths, if any, of sick time or other paid or unpaid time off. Regions can also vary regarding mandates for other types of leave, like jury service leave, victim and witness leave, emergency responder leave, voting leave, parental leave, and military leave. Ali, do you have thoughts on managing that from a remote workplace culture perspective?
Yes. So paid time off and leave policies should be tailored to the company culture in terms of how it's being worded in the things like the employee handbook. And while they should be aimed at being legally compliant throughout the United States and wherever employees are working, it's important to cultivate a culture of inclusivity. I recommend that it's best to adhere to the laws of the strictest scenario and then work backwards. And so in that way, you're creating a company policy that provides enough considerations for all of your teammates. Some tactics to allow for compliant and positive cultural norms at work could be things such as having company-wide holidays that can be time off for all employees, regardless of what country they're located in. Policies for taking time off that are national holidays per country is also a strategy that you can use. In order to do that, it's important to have all of the ones that are being counted listed out so that everybody is on the same page about what national holidays per country look like. Flexible paid time off policies, also sometimes referred to as unlimited time off policies, are common with remote companies and tech companies where employees have more freedom on their work hours. In these scenarios, boundaries for remote work and creating management support for sick days and time off are really important for recovery. Just because you can work from bed doesn't mean that you should. And I think this is a trap that a lot of remote workers fall into is like, oh, I can work from home so I can sleep and then work and be on my sofa. But then you're not getting healthy. And as a company, you're not thinking about how you can use sick days to support cultural norms of taking time off. In my experience, having some additional guidelines is really important here. So some things that I've seen work really well is minimum time off policies in relation to unlimited time off to encourage people to actually use their days off, and having the leadership in the organization lead from example and exhibit the behaviors that they write in their handbook. So in some of the remote companies that I admire the most, I've seen CEOs take, for example, paternity leave for up to a month because that is what's allowed of them. Or senior leadership take 5 weeks of vacation off in a year because there is an unlimited policy with a recommended minimum. And so these are things where the behaviors of the leadership should match up with what's written in the employee handbook, all while making sure that it's legally compliant. There are other fringe benefits that are pretty common as well as we talk about creating a culture of inclusivity and remote work culture. And those are things such as stipends, wellness benefits that can elevate from minimums that are set on this per state or per country basis.
Thanks, Ali. On the fringe benefit side, employers will need to be mindful of the potential tax implications of the fringe benefits, which can also vary by region. Going back to remote workplace expectations, what about expectations regarding particular work hours?
Yes. So there are 3 strategies that I've seen remote companies use to have very clear expectations around working hours. So those 3 are having general guidelines for overlap. And this overlap is great for impromptu synchronous communication. So for example, I've seen written in job descriptions things like you should have 4 hours of office hours that overlap per day that will help increase collaboration of the team. And that can be designated to a certain time zone. So you might see something like 4 hours between the times of 9 to 5 Eastern time zone hours. These are great for roles that are collaborative in nature. So you might see this for designers that want to do design sprints together, or engineers, especially junior engineers that might be learning through things like peer programming. And so wanting to make sure that there's always someone else online to support that employee or that contractor when they're getting their work done. So that's one strategy that I've seen remote companies use. A second one is guidelines around hours per week or project-based expectations. So very clearly stating that we employ people based off of a 40-hour work week norm, but there is flexibility on how that is determined. And so those 40 hours can be completed in various times throughout different time zones in the day. In order to have this be effective from a cultural standpoint, projects should have very clear deadlines, and there should be deliverables that are set regardless around the numbers of hours to complete. And then the third strategy that I've seen is the most open-ended strategy. So a strategy in which there are set meeting times. So for example, every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern, you're expected to be on this meeting for an hour. And everything else is up to the employee to determine based off of flexible and independent working hours.
On the legal side of things, work hours often implicate various employment laws. For example, internationally, certain countries have limits regarding the amount of hours employees can be expected to work. In the U.S., on the other hand, rather than imposing limits, employers are required to pay certain employees premium overtime pay for any hours over 40 hours in a week, although these requirements can also vary from state to state within the U.S. In the U.S., all employees are either eligible for overtime pay and called non-exempt in the legal world, or ineligible for overtime pay and therefore called exempt in the legal world from those requirements. In general, the law, not the employee or employer choice, will dictate whether an employee can be exempt or non-exempt. The default under the U.S. law is that all employees are non-exempt and must be paid overtime. Broadly speaking, to be exempt under federal law, the employee must meet both a salary test and a duties test. For the salary test, the employee must earn at least $684 per week in guaranteed compensation. For the duties test, the employee's actual job duties, not just a written job description, must fit within a number of specifically listed categories. Some of the more common exemptions by function, for example, are the administrative exemption, the professional exemption, and the executive exemption. For non-exempt remote employees, they must be paid for all hours worked. Employers must prohibit them from working off the clock and train them about this policy and how to track their time. Because these employees must track and record their hours, employers may wish to consider using electronic time tracking software to assist with that process. Employers will need to ensure, however, that any electronic time tracking software complies with applicable privacy laws, record retention laws, and things like that. If non-exempt employees work remotely without being properly logging their time, they can be disciplined for doing so, but they still have to be compensated for any time they work. Employers should proactively monitor remote non-exempt employees to ensure that all working time is being properly compensated, and this can be difficult when employees are working remotely. Some employers use technology systems that automatically log their non-exempt employees out of the computer systems to prevent employees from working unauthorized overtime. For example, the system can lock the employee out after being logged in for a regular 8-hour workday. Sticking with the topic of work tracking, Ali, do you have thoughts about remote project work tracking and management? Also, what about managing remote employee expense reimbursement requests, which is somewhat similar?
I think it's very important when it comes to remote work to define what the work is and the definition of work to get done in the hours that employees are working. This is especially true for non-exempt employees. So for example, defining daily and weekly task lists and clear terms of deliverables that are needed, as well as the amount of time expected to complete them. So this is really important in order to make sure that the tasks that you're delegating out to certain employees and the expectations around how much time it will be in take is very clear and communicated up front. So one tactic managers can use if an employee is not finished with a task and overtime could be necessary is that the manager should proactively check in and see how things could either be reprioritized and pushed off to the next week or delegated to somebody else in order to help meet the milestone goals. On the expense reimbursement side, I think it's important to have a clear path for where employees should direct their questions about reimbursements. So providing employees, again, similar to the hours worked, it's all about clear guidelines and examples. Communication is key in remote work. So embracing technology for things like receipt management. And if the company is small enough, there can be a lot of benefits in having one person in the company centrally manage these things so that all employee purchases and travel is done on one company credit card. The expense reimbursement issue also dovetails with the broader compensation topic. And so thinking about how this relates again to time worked and compensation in general, because it will impact remote employee salaries. When setting salaries, companies must consider whether they'll compensate employees based primarily on where they live or primarily based off what they do. For example, individuals who perform a job in Hong Kong or New York City frequently receive a premium because of the cost of living there. This can become challenging, though, with the remote workforce, especially when employees might change their base frequently. The concept of salary structures for remote employees is actually like a very hot topic right now as we see more and more companies go remote. Companies are generally following the two methods that I mentioned. So one is paying with regional differences. Companies here might have formulas that they take into consideration the market rate of certain cities. This is a more traditional way of looking at salary, but it has its challenges, as I mentioned, especially if employees are changing bases frequently or moving often from one location to another. Companies may not want to decrease someone's salary simply because they're choosing to relocate. But if they do not do that, they could end up with disparities where people are earning different salaries in the same role. Increasingly, we are seeing companies that are shifting on paying for the actual work done or paying per role. They often use a cross-section of benchmarks, so things like similar sized companies, similar industries, or a cross-section of many markets where they might operate their business and pay the same to employees at a certain level of the organization, regardless of location. This is my personal choice for many reasons. I think this method really creates an inclusive culture, and it pays based off of the value of the work itself, removing any potential bias that might happen, and can also ease complications when employees do choose to relocate.
On the legal side of things, employers do have to ensure that their compensation practices are not either intentionally or unintentionally resulting in pay inequalities between different groups of employees. For example, between men and women or minorities and non-minorities. A pay equity audit can help ensure that there are not unintended adverse consequences of a company's pay structure. Sticking with the issue of risk and potential liabilities, it is also worth noting that insurance requirements are generally jurisdiction-specific too. For example, in the United States, workers' compensation insurance and unemployment insurance are based again on where the employee is located. Employers must have a process for where they can keep track of where their employees are physically working if that changes. Ali, how can employers manage that from an operational perspective?
This is something that managers, with the support of the HR team, should address from day one of an employee joining the company. So in the employee onboarding checklist, employers should have each employee claim a legal office address. This will likely be their primary residency address. Companies should then have an easy way for employees to update HR and their manager on any permanent moves. The process should be explained clearly in the employee handbook and easy to find if you're a year or 2 years into your employment at a company. Companies should send annual reminders to employees. This is a great way for people to confirm or update their home and work addresses if they have changed. And there should be a recurring cadence for proactively checking in with employees to confirm any information is correct. So you might have this done through an automated HRIS system or just someone checking in with them on a certain regular cadence to make sure that all of their employment information is up to date. However, with some of these things, like a permanent physical working address, I personally feel that the laws just don't seem necessarily set up for a remote work environment anymore, and they might need to change in the future. And so one question that I've been really wanting to ask Leann is, what can business leaders and employers do to help mold the law as we keep reinventing work?
That's a good question. So businesses can always participate in lobbying the government for changes they believe will help advance society in the workplace. They can also participate in industry groups to help collaborate with others in their industry and push for change. In addition, I think it's always worth reminding employers that the law almost always sets a minimum floor for compliance. Employers can always, and in many cases often do, provide more generous benefits in terms and conditions of employment than what the law requires. It is important to keep in mind that you are generally never prohibited from treating your employees better than what the law spells out. Another area that comes to mind where the law doesn't quite seem to fit, in my mind, the remote work environment, is the Family and Medical Leave Act in the United States. For an employee to be covered by the law and eligible for its protections, the employee must, among other things, work at a location where the employer has at least 50 employees within 75 miles of the employee's work site. For a fully remote organization, this concept just doesn't make a lot of sense. Because of that, we find that remote work employers lean toward a broader definition and provide FMLA-like benefits to employees regardless of whether they meet the technical requirement. Employers sometimes designate their technical headquarters as the work site for all employees under the FMLA. Delaware, for example, is a common state of incorporation in the U.S., and because its laws are very business-friendly and its courts are the most sophisticated in the country on business matters. By doing this, the employers concede that they will view all of their employees as within 75 miles of each other, regardless of where they are actually located. This leads to FMLA coverage for all employees much faster than would ordinarily happen otherwise. With a fully remote workforce that is widely dispersed, it could be the case that most employees do not work within 75 miles of any other employee, but this can be very difficult to track and administer in practice. So tagging all employees with the same technical work site can help alleviate this burden. The consequence, though, is that FMLA benefits are then provided to employees who would otherwise be ineligible, which is something that not every employer might want to do. Employers must also be mindful of state income tax-related issues associated with the places in which they incorporate and where those employees work, since those can come into play as well. Thanks again for listening to the Working Wise podcast. New episodes are available for download through iTunes, Google Play, and other podcast applications. If you have any topics you would like to hear about on our next Working Wise podcast series, please send them to workingwise@klgates.com. Thanks, Ali.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to Working Wise. New episodes are available for download through iTunes, Google Play, and other podcast applications. If you have any topics you would like to hear about on the next Working Wise podcast, please send them to workingwise@klgates.com.